By
Between
1943, Denmark stood as a subject to German rule while retaining a facade of autonomy.
Denmark occupied a unique and controversial position under German occupation, often referred to as the Model Protectorate. This status was primarily driven by a pragmatic arrangement, where the Danish government chose to cooperate with German authorities to maintain sovereignty.
The dark clouds of the past have lifted, revealing the enduring spirit of this house.
The overwhelming pressure of the encroaching Nazi regime. Denmark supplied essential agricultural and industrial goods to the German war machine, effectively avoiding the brutal, direct military repression seen elsewhere. This period was defined by a delicate balancing act, as the Danish administration attempted to shield citizens from the worst Nazi excesses. The visual reality of this era was marked by a quiet, uneasy tension, as the country functioned under Berlin's watchful, cold eye. Ultimately, the nation struggled to maintain its internal political identity while caught in the suffocating grip of a foreign occupying force. The
year 1940 marked the beginning of a series of events that would alter the course of history,
leading to a swift and calculated political capitulation. Rather than full-scale resistance, the Danish leadership opted for a policy of negotiation to keep the German military at arm's length. This decision created a bizarre paradox, where the government remained in power, yet operated under the shadow of a foreign power. Danish farmers became vital to the German economy, shipping butter, bacon, and meat across the border to feed the Reich's troops.
The German war effort, a machine fueled by industry, resources, and human capital,
dependency that defined the Protectorate years. For the average citizen, the change was subtle at first, but the creeping influence of the occupation soon became impossible to ignore.
They say it started with a power cut, a citywide blackout like they've never seen before.
To prevent potential Allied air raids from finding targets. Rationing cards became a household necessity, as the influx of goods to Germany left the domestic market struggling with severe shortages. The borders were effectively sealed.
Access to radio signals is restricted in this area.
From international news. Everyday life was a series of compromises, where people tried to maintain their routines while navigating new, restrictive German regulations. Public spaces were monitored, and the presence of German uniforms in the streets served as a constant reminder of the occupation. The government's cooperation was a source of intense debate, splitting the population between those who saw survival and those who saw betrayal. Pragmatists argued that this path saved countless lives and prevented the total destruction of Danish culture and democratic infrastructure. Critics, however, viewed the collaboration as a moral failure, arguing that it emboldened the Nazis and compromised the nation's integrity. This internal friction grew as the war dragged on, turning the quiet streets of Copenhagen into a landscape of suspicion and doubt. The Danish police were often caught in the middle, forced to enforce laws that were dictated by the occupying German administration. Newspapers were subject to strict censorship, ensuring that only approved narratives reached the public, further clouding the truth of the war. Despite the restrictions, a sense of national pride persisted, manifesting in small, quiet acts of defiance against the German presence. The Model Protectorate was never a peaceful state. It was a state of suspended animation, waiting for the tides of war to shift. German
goal is
officials
not just
often
to
praised
inform,
the Danish
but to shape
cooperation,
perception.
using
That
it
is
as
the
a
true
propaganda
power
tool
of
to
messaging.
showcase the efficiency of their occupation policies. Yet, behind the closed doors of government offices, the tension remained palpable as ministers tried to protect their citizens from demands. The economic drain on the country was significant, leading to inflation and a black market that thrived in the shadows of scarcity. Families gathered around radio sets, listening to forbidden broadcasts from London, hoping for news that the occupation would soon end. This duality of public compliance and private resistance became the hallmark of the Danish experience during these 3 difficult years. The German demand for labor and resources grew more insistent, testing the limits of the Danish government's ability to negotiate effectively. Each concession made by the government was a bitter pill to swallow. yet they believed it was the only way to avoid total collapse. The political landscape was fragile, with the threat of direct military takeover always looming if the Danish administration failed to comply. This constant threat forced the government to walk a tightrope, balancing the needs of the occupiers against the welfare of the people. Cultural life continued, but it was heavily scrutinized, with artists and writers finding ways to encode messages of hope in their work. The schools remained open, but the curriculum was carefully monitored to ensure that no anti-German sentiment could take root there. As the war turned against Germany, the pressure on the Protectorate increased, making the policy of cooperation harder to sustain. The illusion of a model protectorate began to crack, as the reality of the Nazi regime's true nature became impossible to hide. Danish citizens began to organize in more overt ways, forming underground groups to distribute information and assist those in hiding. The government found itself increasingly isolated, caught between the demands of Berlin and the growing anger of the Danish public. The fragile peace that had defined the early years of the occupation was rapidly disintegrating into a more volatile and dangerous situation. Every day brought new challenges, from food shortages to the fear of sudden arrests that could happen at any moment in the city. The legacy of this period remains one of the most debated chapters in Danish history, reflecting the complexity of survival in wartime.
To understand his legacy, we must examine his public actions and the historical context that shaped
the decisions they had to make. The model protectorate stands as a testament to the difficult choices faced by small nations caught in the path of global conflict. It was a time when the line between victim and collaborator was blurred, creating a moral gray area that still resonates today. The stories of those who lived through these years are filled with the echoes of a country trying to hold onto its soul. As we look back, we see a nation that was forced to adapt to an impossible situation, using every tool at its disposal. The cooperation was not a sign of weakness, but a calculated strategy intended to preserve the core of the Danish democratic state. The tension between the desire for safety and the need for freedom defined the daily lives of everyone living under the occupation. Even in the darkest moments, the spirit of the Danish people remained unbroken, waiting for the day they could reclaim their future. The occupation was a reminder of how quickly the foundations of a society can be tested by the forces of external aggression. The lessons of the model protectorate are complex, teaching us about the limits of diplomacy in the face of total war.
On this
we must
day,
consider
April 9,
the context of the
1940, amidst
time,
the first hours
where
of Nazi
every choice
occupation,
carried the
Denmark's
risk of
neutrality
severe
was
consequences for the entire nation. The story of Denmark from 1940 to 1943 is a profound example of how a nation navigates the pressures of survival. It highlights the struggle to maintain dignity when the basic structures of society are being dismantled by an occupying force. The narrative of this era is not just about the government, but about the resilience of the people who endured the hardship. As we conclude this look at the early years, we see the foundation for the resistance that would eventually rise to power. The model protectorate was a chapter of uncertainty, a period that would ultimately shape the future of Denmark for years to come. The German occupation of Denmark began in April 1940, initiating a period that the Nazis famously branded as a model protectorate.
This carefully crafted image projected an illusion of cooperation aimed at controlling the narrative and maintaining power.
The Third Reich and a Nordic occupied territory. Denmark was strategically valuable to Germany, primarily because of its highly efficient agricultural sector and its specialized industrial output. The Danish government, led by King Christian X and Prime Minister Stauning, chose a policy of cooperation to avoid total destruction. By maintaining the existing administrative structures, the Danish leadership hoped to preserve a semblance of democracy under the shadow of tyranny. This decision was not made lightly, as it required navigating the impossible demands of an aggressive and powerful occupying military force. For the average Danish citizen, the reality of this model status was far from the propaganda images broadcast by the Nazi regime. The most immediate change was the introduction of strict blackouts, which turned the vibrant streets of Copenhagen into dark, silent corridors. Every evening, Windows were covered with heavy curtains to ensure that no
just
light could
another
guide
night.
Allied bombers flying over the North Sea. Life became defined by the constant hum of uncertainty, as the familiar rhythms of pre-war society were systematically dismantled by order. Rationing was implemented almost immediately, affecting everything
Choices
from
have
basic food staples
consequences.
like bread and butter to coal for heating homes. Families had to
Wow,
learn to
it's so
stretch their
warm.
meager supplies,
careful,
often
sweetie.
relying on creative substitutes
it.
to survive the long, harsh winter months. Shortages became a persistent feature of daily
Still
life,
nothing.
creating long
Maybe
queues
tomorrow.
at shops where empty shelves were a common, disheartening sight. The closure
Global
of national borders
constraints.
effectively cut Denmark
The
off from
fate
the
of
rest of the
Denmark
world,
is at a
deepening a sense of
crossroads.
profound isolation. Information from the outside world was heavily censored, and the press was forced to print only what the occupiers deemed acceptable. Despite these constraints, the Danish government continued to function, attempting to shield its citizens from the worst of Nazi interference. This delicate balancing act required constant negotiation, as officials tried to appease German demands while protecting the core of society. The economic integration with Germany meant that Danish goods were funneled directly into the war effort of the Axis powers. This forced economic cooperation became a point of contention, as the nation's productivity was effectively harnessed by the enemy's machine. As the war dragged on, the initial hope that the occupation would be brief and relatively benign began to slowly evaporate. The psychological toll of living under constant surveillance and restricted movement
All systems
began to
are
weigh
go.
heavily on the collective national consciousness. Social life was curtailed by curfews, and public gatherings were monitored to prevent any form of organized dissent or political unrest. The government's policy of cooperation, while intended to save
It's
lives,
time to find
created a
out who I am.
complex and often painful internal moral dilemma. For many, the sight of German soldiers patrolling the streets was a daily reminder of the loss of their hard-won sovereignty. This persistent presence of the occupier
The path
forced
of
every
least
Dane to choose
resistance
their
is
own
not
path
always the
between
right
passive
one.
compliance and quiet, hidden resistance.
Every
The
era
debate over
builds
this
its own
period
history,
has remained a
but it is
central
through
theme in
interpretation
Danish
that we
history,
understand it, are those
reflecting the
that define us.
difficulty of judging past survival strategies. Some argue that the pragmatic approach of the government was the only way to prevent the total annihilation of the Danish state.
Danish
They point to the
civilian
fact that
casualties
Denmark
were over
avoided the
15
massive
times
civilian
lower than the
casualties
average of
seen in
other occupied nations.
during the same period. Others, however, view this period as a time of moral compromise, where the desire for survival outweighed the need for defiance. They contend that by cooperating, the government inadvertently provided the Nazis with a veneer of legitimacy and essential resources. This tension between survival and resistance created deep fissures within the Danish population that lingered for decades after the war. The government's attempts to maintain order were often seen as collaboration by those
The
who felt
choice
the
is
time
clear.
for resistance was immediate. Yet, the authorities
We
maintained
see the
that
truth.
any open rebellion
We
would
will
have
not
resulted
be
in the immediate
silenced.
installation of a brutal puppet regime. This fear of a harsher occupation kept the population in a state of
Surveillance
uneasy
status
compliance,
normal.
fearing the consequences of any overt action. The scarcity of
all I
goods
have.
meant that the black
It's
market
enough.
flourished, creating new social
Be careful.
tensions and further complicating the daily struggle. People had to navigate a world where neighbors were watched, and trust became a rare commodity in the face of occupation. The intellectual and cultural life of the nation was also stifled, as artists and writers struggled under the weight of censorship. Despite the restrictions, small acts of defiance occurred, from the wearing of
Be
patriotic
careful.
symbols to the circulation of underground news. These quiet gestures of resistance provided a sense of hope, even as the reality of the occupation tightened its iron grip. The
Global
government's
constraints,
cooperation was
the
always
ties that
precarious,
bind Denmark
constantly
and
threatened
Berlin
by the
are
shifting
being
demands
tested.
of the German military command in Berlin. Every
Establishing a
concession
firm
made by
presence
the
in
Danish
the Nordic
leadership was
market is a
calculated
key
risk,
move in our
aimed
global
at preserving
strategy.
the nation's integrity for a future peace. The moral weight of these decisions was felt at every level of society, from the
weight is
highest
crushing.
officials to the ordinary factory worker. As the war progressed, the facade of the model protectorate began to
This
crack
the
under
end
the
of the
pressure of
beginning.
increasing German demands. The
global
economic drain on the
constraints,
country became more
a
severe,
stark
leading
reminder
to
of
further
the
reductions
fragility
in the
of our
standard of living for
economies.
all citizens. The psychological pressure of the occupation was exacerbated by the constant fear
Time
of
is running
deportation
out.
or arrest for those suspected of dissent. Yet, the structure of the
Amid
Danish
the
state remained
tempest,
largely
its
intact,
foundation
a
stands
testament to the
firm.
effectiveness of the government's initial strategy.
A
This
detailed
period
case study of the key events from 1940 to 1943
stands
sheds
as a
light on the
unique
turning
case
point of the
study
war.
in the history of the Second World War in Europe. It challenges our understanding of what it means to live under occupation and the moral ambiguity inherent in such a situation. The legacy of the model protectorate is not one of simple heroism or
Global
betrayal,
constraints.
but of a nation caught in a trap. The choices made by the Danish people were dictated by
The
the
final
brutal
push is
reality of a
upon us.
continent engulfed
We
in
must
total globalized warfare. Reflecting on
Every
this time
choice
requires
comes with a
nuanced
price.
view,
Is the
acknowledging
cost
both
of
the pragmatic
progress too high
necessity
to bear?
and the profound cost of the occupation. The debate continues to evolve as new historical documents provide further insight into the secret negotiations of the wartime government. It serves as a reminder of the fragility of democracy when faced with the overwhelming force of an expansionist military power. The stories of those
A
who
letter
lived
from
through
Yuan
these
Fang
years are filled with the complexities of
days
navigating a
before
world turned
email.
upside down. Their experiences highlight the difficulty of maintaining a
This is a
national
clear
identity while under
violation
the
of
thumb
Danish
of a foreign,
sovereignty.
hostile regime. Ultimately, the history of the model protectorate is a mirror held up to the ethical challenges of survival in dark times. It forces us to ask what we would do if faced with the same impossible choices in a similar moment of crisis. The Danish experience remains a vital part of the broader narrative of the war, offering lessons on resilience and compromise. As we look back, we see a nation that survived, but at a price that was paid in the currency of moral uncertainty. The story of the model protectorate is, in the end, a testament to the enduring struggle for dignity in the face of adversity.